Rain had been falling over Vancouver for 6 days straight, the kind of rain that stopped being weather and became something more like a condition of living. When a man named Joseph Tran stood under the awning of the Fairmont Pacific Rim and held a briefcase that did not belong to him, he had found it 4 minutes earlier, wedged between the rear wheel of a black Escalade and the concrete lip of the hotel's underground parkade exit. The car had already gone. The briefcase was the kind that closed with 2 brass latches and had a monogram pressed into the leather near the handle. He didn't recognize the initials. He set it on the hood of his truck and opened it. The money was banded in stacks of 5,000. He didn't count past 4 before he closed the latches again. Joseph was 41 years old. He had a 9-year-old son named Felix. No, not Felix. He had reminded himself since the day he brought the boy home from the hospital. Not that name. The boy's name was Mateo. Mateo. He had a son named Mateo, who had been born with a congenital heart defect the cardiologist described, with practiced evenness, as manageable. Manageable was a word that meant different things depending on whether you had insurance. Joseph had lost his benefits 8 months ago, when the union contract at the shipyard expired, and the new one hadn't been signed, and the interim period stretched and stretched like taffy pulled thin until it snapped. He had $900 in his account. He had a letter from BC Children's Hospital in the glove box of his truck about a procedure the cardiologist was recommending before Mateo's 10th birthday. The estimate on the letter was $47,000, which was what it cost after partial provincial coverage. It might as well have said $4 million. The number sat in his chest every morning when he woke up the same way a stone sits at the bottom of a pond, permanently, weightlessly, always there. He stood in the rain with his hand on the briefcase. Then he picked it up, walked through the sliding glass doors of the Fairmont lobby, and set it on the front desk. "I found this in the parkade," he said. "I don't know whose it is, but there's money in it. You'll want to call someone." The woman at the desk stared at him. She looked at the briefcase. She looked back at him. "Your name, sir?" "Doesn't matter." He was already stepping back from the counter. "Just make sure it gets back to whoever lost it." He walked out through the lobby and into the rain and did not look back. On the 14th floor of the hotel, behind a window that looked down over the covered entrance, a woman named Catherine Holt stood with a glass of sparkling water in one hand and her phone in the other, and she watched the man in the work jacket walk back out into the rain without pausing once, without checking over his shoulder, without doing any of the things she would have assumed a person in his position would do. She watched until he turned the corner onto Burrard and disappeared. Then she set the glass down very carefully on the table beside her and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Find out who that is." Her assistant, a composed young man named Preston, who had been with her for 3 years and had learned the particular rhythm of her instructions, was already reaching for his phone. The apartment on Powell Street had good bones, which was the real estate phrase Joseph had used when he signed the lease 2 years ago, and which meant in practice that the kitchen was too small, the bathroom window didn't close all the way, and the radiator in Mateo's room made a sound at night like a slow argument between 2 people who were no longer sure what they were arguing about. He had learned to sleep through it. Mateo had never seemed to notice. Mateo noticed most things, just not the things adults tended to notice. He did not notice the pile of hospital correspondence that lived on the kitchen table beneath a stack of unread flyers. He did notice when the light changed in the afternoon, the way it came through the west window and turned the dust in the air into something almost beautiful. He noticed birds. He could identify 16 species of bird that lived in or passed through East Vancouver, and he had written each one on a piece of paper folded into quarters that he kept in the front pocket of his jeans at all times like a passport. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his sketchbook when Joseph came in, drawing what appeared to be a heron standing in something shallow. Joseph hung his jacket on the hook by the door and stood for a moment listening to the sound of the rain on the window. How was school? Fine. Mateo didn't look up. Mrs. Bautista said my essay was the best one. Which essay? About the estuary. He turned the sketchbook so Joseph could see. The heron had extraordinary patience in it somehow, standing in that still water, and Joseph looked at it longer than he meant to. "That's really good, bud." Matteo took the sketchbook back and added a line near the bird's feet. "Dad, you have that? Look." "What look?" "The one where something happened." Joseph sat down across from him. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Something happened," he said. He told him about the briefcase. Not all of it. He told him he found something that belonged to someone else, and he gave it back. Matteo listened with the stillness he had, that qualia Joseph had never been able to fully explain to other people, like a child who had been born knowing that the world was complicated, and had made peace with that early. "How much was in it?" Matteo asked. "Enough." Matteo turned back to his drawing. He added a small line near the horizon. "Being broke doesn't mean you have to be bent," he said, in the voice of someone repeating something they had heard a number of times. Joseph looked at him for a moment. "That's right. You taught me that." "I know." "It's a good one," Matteo said, and reached for his pencil again. Catherine Holt was 52 years old, which she mentioned to no one, and which was visible to no one in the particular way that only money makes possible. She had built Holt Meridian Capital from a one-room office in Calgary 23 years ago into a portfolio management firm with offices in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and she ran it with a combination of intelligence and instinct that she had spent years refusing to apologize for. She had been married once, briefly, to a man who had admired her precision and then, gradually, come to resent it. She had not been surprised by the end of the marriage. She had, if she was honest with herself, been relieved. She did not trust most people. This was not a character flaw she had acquired. It was a conclusion she had reached through evidence, the way a scientist reaches a conclusion through data. Slowly, reluctantly, and with accumulated proof she could not responsibly ignore. Her ex-husband had restructured their joint accounts 6 weeks before he told her he was leaving. Her former business partner had been feeding quarterly projections to a competitor for a year before she caught him. Her most trusted advisor had taken a consulting fee from a fund she was about to acquire, disclosed it to no one, and described this later, in the arbitration, as an oversight. She had rebuilt after each of these. She was very good at rebuilding. What she had not managed to rebuild was the specific kind of openness that precedes being surprised by another person. Then she had watched a man in a damp work jacket put a briefcase full of money on a hotel desk and walk away without leaving his name. Preston set the folder on her desk at 7 the following morning, in the way he had of presenting things he was slightly uncertain about, which was that he laid it at the edge of the desk rather than in the center. "Joseph Tran," he said. 41. Widowed. 1 son. 9. Congenital heart condition. He was a marine electrician at C-SPAN, Burrard Dry Dock. Lost his benefits 8 months ago in the labor dispute. He's been doing contract electrical work since. Catherine looked at the folder without opening it. "And the briefcase?" "It belonged to a Mr. Aldrich Sorel. He's a private equity partner, visiting from Montreal. He'd apparently set it down to take a call and forgot it when his car arrived." "How much was in it?" $87,000. She opened the folder. Preston stood at the edge of the desk with the careful patience of a man who had learned when to speak and when not to. He spoke now. "There's something else. He lost his wife 4 years ago. Workplace accident, North Shore. She was a dock worker. There was a third-party liability claim." He paused. Holt Meridian held the institutional bond for the company involved. When the company went to restructuring, the liability pool was one of the assets. Catherine looked up slowly. The settlement her estate was eligible for was restructured into a deferred payment tied to the company's performance metrics. "Which means," she received nothing. The company recovered. The metrics were met 18 months later, but the claim window had closed. The office was very quiet. The only sound was the soft percussion of rain against the triple-glazed window that looked out over Burrard Inlet, where the cranes stood patient and gray in the morning fog. "Pull the original liability file," Catherine said. "Everything. Every document. I want it by tonight." Preston nodded. At the door he stopped. There's a version of the story that's been circulating in the trades for years, that his wife was partly at fault, that she hadn't followed safety protocols. Catherine looked at him carefully. Was she? Preston held her gaze for a moment. The original safety report doesn't support that, but no one corrected the other version. He closed the door. Catherine stood at the window for a long time. Below her, a container ship moved silently through the inlet, its red hull darker than the water around it. Somewhere in the city, a man was making breakfast for a boy who drew herons from memory. And he did not know that the woman who had watched him do the right thing was the same woman whose institution had once let the wrong thing stand unchallenged, and called it, in the appropriate paperwork, a closed matter. She had built her career on the principle that trust had to be earned through demonstrated behavior. She had watched demonstrated behavior through a hotel window on a rainy Tuesday. She did not know yet what to do with that. What she knew was that the file she had asked for was going to tell her something she was not going to enjoy reading. She was right. The liability file arrived in a banker's box at 6 in the evening, delivered by a courier who did not ask her to sign anything, which was how Preston arranged things when he wanted her to be able to say, later, that she had received it informally. She appreciated this about him. She appreciated a great number of things about Preston that she never said aloud. She did not read the executive summary first. She read the original safety investigation. It was thorough and cold in the way that safety reports are, full of diagrams and timestamps and the carefully neutral language of people who document disasters for a living. At 14:22 on a Thursday in November, a hydraulic lift on berth 7 had failed. The failure was attributed to a maintenance schedule that had been, in the report's language, inconsistently adhered to for a period of 14 months prior. 3 workers were injured. 1 died. Her name was Anya Tran, née Kowalski. She was 36 years old. She had been on berth 7 because she was covering a shift for a colleague whose child was sick. She had followed the procedure exactly. The lift had failed anyway because the seal that was supposed to have been replaced 6 weeks prior had not been. There was no finding of fault against any worker. Catherine read the section on the liability restructuring next. It was efficient and bloodless, the way financial documents are when they are written by people who never intend to read them aloud in a room with the people affected. The third-party liability pool, which included Anya Tran's estate, had been reclassified in the second stage of restructuring. A footnote on page 31 explained that affected claimants had been notified by Standard Post. The claim window was 90 days. The restructuring had created a delay of 62 days between the notification being sent and it being received due to, the footnote explained, an administrative processing period. Holt Meridian had not flagged the delay. Holt Meridian had held the bond that made the restructuring possible. Catherine sat with the file open in front of her for a long time. She had not known Anya Tran's name. She had reviewed the restructuring terms at a high level, the yield, the risk profile, the duration of exposure. She had been thorough in the ways she was always thorough. She had not been thorough in the ways that would have required her to read a list of claimants on page 47 of an appendix, and notice a woman's name on it, and ask whether the 62-day administrative delay was going to cost that woman everything she was owed. She had signed the approval. Her name was on the bond instrument. Her firm had made money. A dead woman's estate had received nothing. Her husband had spent 4 years raising a sick child alone, losing his benefits, doing shift work in the rain. And a story had been moving through the docks for that same stretch of time that said the accident had been partly her fault. And no one, not the company, not the bondholder, not anyone with access to the original safety report, had stood up and said that story was wrong. Catherine closed the file. She sat in her office until the cleaning crew had come and gone, and the building had gone quiet around her, and the lights of the North Shore were reflecting on the surface of the inlet in long broken lines. Then she picked up her phone. "Preston," she said, "I need you to find me a property. Something that needs significant electrical work. West Side, not downtown. Buy it through Coastline Property Holdings, not my name. Have the deed registered under a numbered company. She paused. And find me a copy of the current C-SPAN Union Bulletin. I want to know who's doing contract electrical on the west side right now. There was a small silence on the other end. Tonight? Preston said. By tomorrow morning, Catherine said, and hung up. The house was on West 19th in Kerrisdale, a 1952 Craftsman with good original bones, and a rewiring situation that a home inspector had described, in the report Catherine received, as significantly deferred. The knob and tube wiring in the upper floors had been partially updated at some point in the 90s, and then left where it was like an argument someone had lost interest in finishing. The panel in the basement was a thing of genuine concern. Catherine stood in the kitchen on a gray Thursday morning, listening to the sound of old pipes settling, and thought about what she was doing. She was doing something she had not done in 23 years, which was entering a situation she could not fully control, with a person whose opinion of her mattered more to her than she had any rational justification for. She had met him once, from a hotel window, in the rain. She had watched him for 11 minutes before Preston brought the car around. She had slept poorly since. She had practiced the name twice in the mirror before calling. Sarah Cole, recently separated, relocated from Toronto, needed the house made safe before winter. He answered on the second ring. Tran Electrical. His voice was even and lower than she expected, though she didn't know why she had expected anything. She gave him the address. She gave him the name. She said Thursday at 9 if that worked. He said it did. He said his rate was $45 an hour and he'd give her a written estimate before starting anything. She said that was fine. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she found professionally unacceptable. He arrived at 8:58. She had been standing at the kitchen window since 8:40. He was taller than the hotel window had suggested. The canvas jacket was the same one, or one like it. He shook her hand at the door with a grip that was careful without being tentative, and when she showed him into the front hall, he moved the way people move when they are looking at something professionally. Not at her, not at the decor, but at the ceiling corners and the baseboards and the angle of the floor. Whoever updated this partially knew what they were doing, he said without preamble. The problem is, they stopped knowing about halfway through. I'll want to look at the basement first. She said that was fine. He disappeared through the basement door, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall. It did not feel like surveillance. She had done due diligence before. She knew the feeling of due diligence. This felt entirely unlike due diligence. It felt instead like sitting very still in the presence of something that had not decided yet whether to trust the room. He gave her the estimate after 90 minutes. He had written it in a small green notebook, in a hand that was precise and slightly cramped. The hand of someone who had learned to write in tight spaces. The number was fair. She had paid for enough electrical work in commercial properties to know exactly how fair it was. This is below what it should cost, she said. He looked at her without surprise, as though he had been told this before. It's what the work costs, the market rate. I know what the market rate is. This is my rate. He closed the notebook. I don't add a margin for the neighborhood. She looked at him. He looked back at her calmly, like a man who had made his position clear and did not feel the need to defend it further. All right, she said. He came back on Monday and again on Wednesday. He did not make conversation that was not about the work. He did not ask about her separation, or where she was from, or why she had chosen Kerrisdale. He looked at walls and wiring and the water damage behind the upstairs bathroom tiles that he'd identified on the first visit and photographed before she could decide whether to ask why he was photographing it. So you have a record, he said, when she asked. Before I touch it, in case there's a question later. On his second visit, she left her bag on the kitchen counter when she went to answer her phone in the other room. It was in there, the whole thing. Her actual wallet, with her real cards in it, with her real name on them. She came back 7 minutes later. The bag was exactly where she had left it. He was upstairs, replacing a junction box he had found during the previous visit that was, in his words, optimistic about its own capacity. She stood in the kitchen and held the bag, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific, disorienting sensation of having been wrong about something important. Matteo came on a Saturday because the woman who normally watched him on Saturday mornings had a family thing in Abbotsford, and Joseph had 2 hours of work he could not easily reschedule. He called ahead. "I don't usually bring him on jobs," he said. "He can wait in the truck. He won't be any trouble." "Bring him in," Catherine said. She said it before she had finished deciding to say it. Matteo came up the front walk in a yellow raincoat, 2 sizes too large, and carrying a sketchbook with a Pacific Coast bird sticker on the cover. He studied Catherine from under the hood with the methodical seriousness of a field scientist. "Hi," Catherine said. "Hi," said Matteo. "Are those Steller's jays?" He was looking past her at the cedar tree visible through the kitchen window. 2 large blue-black birds were moving through the branches. "I think so," Catherine said, which was an honest answer. "They're really loud," Matteo said, as though this was a quality he admired. "They are," Catherine said. He came inside. He settled himself at the kitchen table with the sketchbook and began to draw without being asked. He did not turn on the television. He did not look at his phone. He drew in long, quiet strokes and occasionally looked up at the window, with the focused inattention of someone whose best thinking happened sideways. Catherine brought him a plate with crackers and apple slices and set it beside him without comment. He ate without looking up. After a while, without putting his pencil down, he said, "Are you lonely?" She did not answer immediately. She sat down across from him. "Sometimes," she said. He nodded as though this was the right answer. "My dad gets lonely. He doesn't say so, but I can tell. It's the way he sits." He turned the sketchbook slightly to add something to the left side. "You sit like that a bit." Catherine looked at the wall for a moment. "You're very observant. He taught me." Matteo held up the sketchbook. He had been drawing the kitchen window, the jays and the cedar tree beyond it, and along the bottom sill, in very precise small letters, "Things worth watching." He tore the page off and set it on the table between them. She did not say anything. She picked it up carefully and looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it once and put it in the front pocket of her vest, and she did not take it out again for many days. The first sign of something wrong came 9 days later. A contractor named Brennan, who had been using Joseph for subcontract work on a retrofit project in Mount Pleasant, called to say the project had stalled and he wouldn't need him for the foreseeable future. 3 days after that, a property manager on Commercial Drive who had called Joseph 3 times in the past year sent a short text saying she was going in a different direction with her maintenance contracts. By the end of the following week, the only consistent work Joseph had was the house on West 19th. He didn't say anything to Catherine about it. She heard it anyway. She was in the backyard checking a fence repair he had done when she heard him on the phone in the driveway, his voice quiet and controlled in the way voices go when the speaker is choosing every word like someone crossing a river on uncertain stones. "What exactly is the story?" he said. "I need to know what people are saying." He listened. "That's not what happened, and I think you know that." He listened again. "No, I understand, thank you." He stood for a moment with his hand over his mouth. Then he came back inside and went back to work as though nothing had happened. That night, in the parkade beneath Holt Meridian's Yaletown office, Preston sat in his car, on a call he did not put through the company switchboard. The person on the other end had a name Preston had been careful, over the past 3 years, never to say out loud in any room with a recording device. "She's getting attached," Preston said. "I'm managing it." He ended the call and sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off. Then he started the car and drove to his apartment on the West End and slept without difficulty. The story moved through the electrical trade the way old stories move when someone wants them to, in pieces. Never quite consistent, always just credible enough. A foreman in Burnaby heard it from a site manager. A property developer in Coquitlam heard it from his insurance broker. By the 3rd week, the version in circulation said that Joseph Tran had been responsible for a wiring fault that had contributed to the accident that killed his wife, that he had done the work on berth 7 himself and then let the liability fall somewhere else. The version was not true. It did not need to be true. It only needed to reach the right people, which it did. His son's school called about the outstanding hot lunch fees, $42, that had gone unpaid for 2 months. His landlord called to say the rent grace period had ended, and the formal notice would be mailed within the week. He didn't tell Matteo about the rent. Matteo found out anyway. He found out on a Wednesday afternoon because he was sitting in the kitchen at the house on West 19th with his sketchbook, while Joseph replaced a light fixture in the upstairs hall, and Catherine had left the television on low in the front room before she went out to a meeting, and the noon program ran a segment on Canadian business leadership, and the second person they profiled was a woman in a dark gray blazer standing outside a glass building on Burrard Street, and the graphic on the screen said, Catherine Holt, founder and CEO, Holt Meridian Capital. Matteo watched for about 20 seconds. Then he went to the foot of the stairs and called up, very quietly, Dad, the woman whose house this is, she's on TV. There was a pause, then the sound of a tool being set down very carefully on a hard surface. Joseph came down the stairs, the way a man walks when he's already had the conversation in his head, and it did not go well. He stood in the doorway of the front room and watched the segment without expression for a long time. Long enough for the anchor to finish the profile and move to the next story. He did not look at Matteo. Catherine had come back 10 minutes earlier through the side door. She was standing very still in the kitchen doorway, with both hands at her sides. Joseph turned and looked at her. It was not rage. She had been bracing for rage, and what she got instead was something worse, which was the measured look of a man who had just understood that a room he had entered freely had different walls than he'd been told. He was giving her every chance to explain. She could see it. He was holding that space open with effort. Is there anything you want to tell me? He said. Caleb. She stopped. She had said the wrong name. She started again. Joseph, let me explain, please. He looked at Matteo. Get your coat, bud, it's all right, get your coat. Matteo went, slowly watching both of them. Joseph set his keys on the kitchen counter. He picked up his toolbox. He looked at her one more time, and the look was the kind that takes years to learn how to give. Not unkind, not harsh, but closed. Entirely closed. Whatever you thought you were doing here, he said. I think you know that it's done. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam the door. He took his son by the hand at the front step and walked to the truck in the rain, and she stood in the kitchen and listened to the engine start, and listened to it leave, and kept standing there after it had gone. 48 hours later, Joseph sat at his kitchen table in Powell Street with a printed bus schedule and a duffel bag that wasn't quite full enough. His mother's cousin in Lethbridge had a house with a spare room and a yard and had said, over the phone, that of course they should come. It was not even a question. He had packed Matteo's sketchbooks first. He was going through Matteo's bag one more time when Matteo came out of the bedroom and put his hand flat on the table and said, Dad, stop. Joseph looked up. Matteo was in his pajamas. He stood in the kitchen with his bird list folded in his front pocket, and his expression was the one that Joseph had spent 9 years trying to decode. Not afraid, exactly, but paying a particular quality of attention. Something's wrong, Matteo said. His breathing was off. Not badly, but Joseph knew the off rhythm the same way he knew the sound of every other thing in the apartment, by feel, by the particular quality of its absence from normal. He was across the kitchen in 2 steps. By the time he was carrying Matteo down the stairwell with his coat still unbuttoned, the breathing had the sound that meant they were not going home for a while. He ran the 3 blocks to St. Paul's because it was 3 minutes faster than waiting for a car. The triage nurse took one look at Matteo's lips and did not make Joseph wait. The intake clerk, 20 minutes later, asked him about insurance with the practiced neutrality of someone who knew exactly what the answer was going to be. We're in a gap period, Joseph said. I can pay. The pre-authorization for the cardiac monitoring program is $15,000, the clerk said. We need that on file before he can be admitted to the specialized unit. Is there a card? Or, I'll pay, Joseph said. Give me a minute. He stepped away from the desk. He stood by the window. He looked out at the parking lot. He took out his phone and opened his bank app and looked at the number for a while. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went back to the desk and told the clerk he needed a few more minutes, and he sat down in the plastic chair in the corner and put his head in his hands. He had told Mateo, in grocery store lineups and waiting rooms and cold mornings with the heat off, that being broke didn't mean you had to be bent. He had told him in the voice of a man who believed it. He did not know if the man in this chair was still that man, or someone who had used that phrase so many times it had become a kind of echo, the shape of a belief without the substance. He stayed in that chair for a long time. The vending machine hummed. A janitor pushed a mop past without looking up. Someone down the hall laughed suddenly and then stopped. A nurse came out at 12:47 to tell him Mateo was stable on the basic protocol. She used the phrase "for now" twice. She said if his condition changed overnight, the basic protocol would not be sufficient. She said this with the calibrated neutrality of someone who had said it before and who was watching him to see if he understood what she wasn't saying. He said he understood. She went back through the doors. He sat in the chair and looked at his hands and thought about the bus schedule on the kitchen table and the duffel bag that wasn't full enough, and about a woman in a dark gray blazer standing outside a glass building, and about a briefcase full of money he had returned in the rain because he could not look at his son in the morning otherwise, and about the particular cruelty of the distance between those two facts. Across the city, in an office where the lights had been on all night, Catherine Holt sat with two things in front of her on the desk. The first was a draft statement, prepared by her communications team, recommending that she take a leave of absence from Holt Meridian Capital in light of ongoing press inquiries into the Tran labor matter. It had been sent to her at 11 p.m. by the chair of her board, accompanied by a phone call she had let go to voicemail, and then another call at 1 a.m. that she had also let go to voicemail, and a short text at 2 a.m. that said simply, "Think carefully." The second thing was the liability file, open to page 47, the appendix with the claimant names. Anya Tran's name on line 19, in font small enough that you could miss it without trying, just by not being the kind of person who read appendices. She had been that person. She had been very skilled for 23 years at being that person. She thought about a man standing in a hotel parkade with a briefcase that wasn't his. She thought about a boy in a yellow raincoat who drew birds from memory and left drawings on kitchen tables for people he had just met. She thought about a green notebook with precise small handwriting and a rate that didn't add a margin for the neighborhood. She thought about a wallet on a kitchen counter with her real cards in it, sitting exactly where she had left it, while the man who hadn't touched it replaced a junction box upstairs. She thought about a line in the safety report. The seal had been scheduled for replacement 6 weeks prior. It had not been replaced. She thought about whose name was on the bond that had made the restructuring possible. She picked up the draft statement. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it aside. She picked up her phone. "Preston," she said when he answered on the second ring. "Get my communications director. I need a press conference. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the Holt Meridian lobby." No pre-screened questions. There was a short silence. The topic? The Birth 7 accident, November 2020. "I want every outlet." A longer silence. "Catherine, are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything," she said. "Make the calls." She hung up. She did not sit down again. She walked to the window and stood with her hands in the pockets of her jacket and looked out over the water, where the lights of the North Shore were doing their long, patient work on the surface of the inlet. She thought about what it was going to cost. She thought about it clearly, without flinching, the way she had always done her best thinking, at windows in the dark, when the city was quiet enough to tell the truth. She thought it was not the most expensive thing she had ever done. It was the first thing in a long time she was going to do without subtracting something important from the price. The press conference was at 10. She stood at a small wooden lectern in the Holt Meridian lobby with no notes and a charcoal blazer she had owned for 11 years, and she began without greeting anyone. In November of 2020, she said, a hydraulic lift failed at Berth 7 at the C-SPAN facility on the North Shore. 3 workers were injured. One died. Her name was Anya Tran. She was 36 years old. She was covering a shift for a colleague whose child was sick. She had followed the correct procedure. The lift failed because a maintenance seal that had been scheduled for replacement 6 weeks prior had not been replaced. The room had been murmuring. The murmuring stopped. The original safety investigation found no fault on the part of any worker. That finding was clear. It has never been publicly corrected by anyone, because an alternative version of events, one that placed partial responsibility on Miss Tran herself, was easier for certain parties and was never challenged. She did not look down. Holt Meridian Capital held the institutional bond that enabled the restructuring of the company responsible for the maintenance failure. The restructuring process resulted in the reclassification of third-party liability claims, including the claim belonging to Miss Tran's estate. An administrative delay of 62 days within a 90-day claim window meant the estate received nothing. My firm did not flag that delay. My signature is on the bond instrument. My firm made money on this transaction. Miss Tran's family received nothing. She placed both hands flat on the lectern. Beginning immediately, Holt Meridian is establishing the Anya Tran Fund, a $60 million endowment funded by my personal assets to provide family and housing support to workers and their families in cases of serious workplace injury in British Columbia. We are additionally reopening and fully reviewing the liability pool from the Birth 7 restructuring, with all eligible settlements to be paid at full original value plus 4 years of accrued interest. She drew a breath. The room was absolutely still. There has been a story circulating in the marine trades for 4 years, suggesting that Joseph Tran, the husband of Anya Tran, a marine electrician who has spent the years since his wife's death raising their son alone, was somehow responsible for the conditions that caused his wife's death. That story is false. It was never true. It was convenient. My firm had access to documentation that would have refuted it clearly, and my firm said nothing. She looked directly at the cameras. As of this morning, I am resigning as Chief Executive Officer and as a Director of Holt Meridian Capital. I am not retaining a consulting role. I am not retaining a board seat. My name is on the instrument that enabled this. The instrument was wrong. The name is mine. She did not take questions. She walked off the small dais, through the lobby, and out the front door to the car that was waiting. And she did not look back at the cameras or at the small of journalists, or at Preston, who was standing very still near the entrance with an expression she did not have the bandwidth to interpret. In the waiting room at St. Paul's Hospital, Joseph watched the press conference on the small wall-mounted screen above the vending machine with the sound off, and he read her lips well enough on the name, Anya Tran, to understand that she was not speaking to the room. The captions came up slowly, lagging the broadcast by about 7 seconds, and he read them and understood, somewhere around the 4th paragraph, what she was doing. She did not say Mateo's name. She did not mention a briefcase in a parkade in the rain. She did not mention a house on West 19th or a kitchen table or a boy who drew birds from memory and left the drawings behind like breadcrumbs. She gave him back his wife's name. She gave him back his own. She had stood in front of every camera she had access to and said, in language that could not be walked back, the story was wrong. Here is who told the right one. He watched it to the end. He did not move when the broadcast cut to an analyst panel. He did not move when a woman in hospital scrubs crossed the room and sat down beside him with a clipboard. Mr. Tran, she said, with the careful, practiced voice of someone delivering good news they weren't expecting to deliver. I wanted to let you know that Mateo's care has been fully authorized under a new program. The Anya Tran Fund has extended its support to cover the specialized cardiac monitoring program and all associated care beginning this morning. He looked at her. The fund, yes, sirs, not, he stopped. The fund is paying. The fund is paying. He looked down at his hands. On the wall screen, a graphic showed Holt Meridian's stock price in a clean descending line. He looked at the woman with the clipboard. He looked at the vending machine. He understood what Catherine had done. She had not put her name on the wire. She had put her name on the building and built the building around the wire. She had constructed the thing large enough that he could walk inside it without having to bow his head. It was not charity, it was restitution. The difference mattered, and she had known it would matter. She had built accordingly. "Yes," he said. "Thank you. Please go ahead." Matteo was moved to the specialized unit the next morning. He woke up 12 hours later with his sketchbook already in his hands. Joseph had put it there and asked for a pencil before he asked for anything else. He drew the window of the hospital room. He drew the particular quality of Vancouver light through institutional glass, which is a difficult light to draw, because it is simultaneously flat and specific. He drew himself in the bed, which required a certain kind of detachment that most 9-year-olds do not have. He drew his father in the chair beside the bed, asleep, with his jacket still on. At the bottom of the page he wrote, in his careful block letters, "He stayed." Joseph folded the drawing and put it inside the breast pocket of his jacket, against his shirt. 6 months later, the days were long and pale in the particular way of Vancouver summers, when the light seems reluctant to leave. Joseph opened a small electrical business out of a workshop space in a converted building on Clark Drive, shared with a furniture maker and a woman who repaired vintage sewing machines. He had a desk by the window, a proper van, and more work than he could handle alone. He hired a second electrician in August. He kept his rate the same. Matteo, now 10, had a sketchbook that was nearly full and a growing list of birds he had identified in person. He had added a section to the folded paper in his pocket for birds he had been reliably told existed but had not yet seen. This section, he explained to his father, was for optimism. Catherine did not appear in the news after the first month. The cycle moved on, the way cycles do, replaced by whatever came after. The Anya Tran fund grew carefully, under a small board she had put in place and then stepped back from. Holt Meridian's share price recovered, then surpassed its previous level, under the leadership of a deputy who had been with the firm for 8 years and was, Catherine had always known, more operationally suited to the role than she was. Preston had been asked to leave the building within 48 hours of the press conference. She had not initiated that inquiry herself. She had made herself available to it, which was a different thing. His current situation was not her concern. She lived now in a smaller apartment in Kitsilano, in a building without a concierge, and she bought her own groceries, which she had not done regularly in 12 years. She found this more interesting than she had expected. She found a great many things more interesting than she had expected. In early September, she went to Jericho Beach, because it was one of those afternoons when the light on English Bay was doing something particular, and she could not stay inside. She had not gone there looking for anyone. She had gone because the herons fished the shallows at Jericho in September, and she had learned this in a list of birds written on a folded piece of paper. She had been shown the previous winter by a boy in a yellow raincoat, and she had remembered it. She saw Matteo first. He was crouched at the waterline with his sketchbook balanced on his knee, completely still, watching the shallows with the focused patience of a young naturalist. He looked up at the exact moment she came around the driftwood log, as though he had heard her footstep across the sand. "Miss Cole," he said, and then, after a beat, "We know that's not your name." "It isn't," Catherine said. "That's okay." He went back to his drawing. "Dad says it takes people a while to be ready to be known." Joseph was 30 meters down the beach, sitting on a log with a paper coffee cup in his hands, watching the water. He had seen her. She could tell by the particular stillness he went to when he was deciding something. He stood up and walked toward her slowly, without hurrying, with the deliberateness of a man who had thought about this moment and was choosing, carefully, how he wanted to meet it. He stopped a few feet away. "Hello," Catherine said. "Hello," he said. Matteo, without looking up from his sketchbook, drifted sideways down the waterline with the elaborate casualness of a child who wanted to give people room. They stood on the sand. The water moved in its patient way. A great blue heron landed in the shallows 15 meters out and stood there absolutely still, watching the surface. "Why did you follow me?" he said. "That night. Why didn't you just send someone to return the briefcase?" She had thought about this for 6 months. She had been thinking about it since the hotel window, Since the rain. Because I'd stopped believing that people could do the things you did, she said. And I needed to see if it was real. I couldn't send someone else to check that. It had to be me. He looked at the heron. The heron did not move. And now, he said, she looked out at the water. At the light doing its September work on the surface of the bay. Now I believe, she said, and I'm learning how to be someone who deserves to. He didn't answer right away. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He looked down the beach to where Matteo was now crouched impossibly close to the waterline, sketching something with the concentration of a person who had forgotten the world had other dimensions. He's been asking, Joseph said, whether we'd see you again. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she had met him, since the hotel window, since the rain, there was something in his expression that she did not have a word for, something that lived just behind a smile, like light under a door that hadn't opened yet. I tell him the same thing I always tell him, he said, that there's a long list of things we haven't seen yet, but they exist. He glanced at her, and the almost smile came slightly closer to being a thing. I put it in the optimism section. Down the beach, Matteo held up his sketchbook without looking around in the direction of the heron. The drawing showed 3 figures on a beach, the heron in the water, and across the bottom, in the careful block letters that he used for things that mattered, the good ones find each other.